After years of silence, Art Garfunkel finally speaks out today, painting a portrait of a friendship that turned into a battleground. His story is about more than simply a feud between two individuals. It's also about the fine line that exists between individual ambition and teamwork in the creative process. Remember the best years of your life, the 1960s. Two young men from Queens, Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel, became famous as the harmonies of the duo Simon Garfunkel. The way their voices blended together was so strange. It sounded like a bridge over troubled water or the sound of complete silence. The outside world saw them as an ideal couple. However, problems were beginning to emerge behind the scenes. Their early bond, which Garfunkel portrays in detail, evolved into an ongoing power struggle. Before Simon's rise to prominence as the band's principal songwriter, Garfunkel and Simon were on equal ground. Their work was propelled by Paul Simon's meticulousness and ambition, while Garfunkel, with his angelic voice, frequently felt relegated to the role of mere singer. Simon thought his songwriting genius went unrecognized, while Garfunkel felt he was being ignored as a result of the relationship. Tensions between them creatively reached a peak in the late 1960s. Bridge Over Troubled Water, their masterpiece, became a metaphor for the interpersonal problems they were experiencing. As a thank you for Garfunkel's support, Simon composed the title track, which features his magnificent voice. However, the song served only to further divide them rather than bring them closer together. The praise Garfunkel received for a song that none of them wrote made Simon happy, and Garfunkel started to feel like an instrument to carry Simon's ideas. In 1970, while filming Catch 22, things finally broke down. Simon was left to compose new music solo, while Garfunkel pursued a side gig as an actor and spent months filming in Mexico. Emotional as well as physical separation ensued. For Simon, Garfunkel's decision to step away from the relationship was an act of betrayal. The pair hardly exchanged words when Garfunkel came back. Later that year, they announced their breakup, and it seemed more like an inevitable than a decision. Once the band broke up, each man went their own way. Albums like Still Crazy helped Simon re-establish himself as a legendary songwriter, and he continued to fly with them. Hits like All I Know helped Garfunkel get recognition, but she still couldn't escape Simon's shadow. Another source of disagreement was the difference in their success after the duo broke up. Simon Garfunkel, who was enjoying his moment in the limelight, showed little interest in rekindling their collaboration, much to Garfunkel's frequent complaints that his contributions were underappreciated. Over the years, the pair reconnected on occasion. Their 1981 Central Park concert, which drew more than 500,000 people, was the most famous. At first glance, it seemed like a tribute to their lasting impact. On the other hand, grudges were harbored in the background. The same artistic differences that had caused them to part ways also hampered their efforts to collaborate on new music. It felt like every time they reconciled, it only served to deepen their animosity and disillusionment. By being so direct and honest about Paul Simon, Art Garfunkel helped break the ice surrounding their tumultuous connection and revealed a pattern that had an impact on Simon's career as a whole. His intelligence and his insatiable need for perfection were inseparable traits of Simon the Man, a quality that brought out his artistic brilliance but caused relationships to become tense as a result. It was frequently as difficult as it was inspiring for individuals brave enough to stand by his side as he pursued his creative dreams. It wasn't just Garfunkel who thought Simon was great and unattainable. Imagine this dotted line in the 1970s, a heyday for melodic songwriting. Common comparisons were drawn between the two colossal giants of the time, Paul Simon and Bob Dylan. In contrast to Simon's refined, careful, and intricately written lyrics, Dylan's raw, gnarled lyrics poured out like wildfires in their music. A subtle but noticeable tension existed between the two due of this comparison. The critical adulation that Dylan commanded was something that Simon was keenly aware of, even though he admired Dylan. While Simon's careful songwriting was occasionally perceived as excessively constructed, Dylan's acclaim for his unfiltered honesty stood in stark contrast. Simon couldn't shake the nagging feeling of competitiveness, even though it wasn't overtly hostile or shown in barbs during interviews. The ever-present shadow of Dylan's legacy was a pain for a man who was driven to excel. One way of looking at it is as a clash of artistic ideologies, the precise approach of Simon and the carefree spontaneity of Dylan. It is possible that Simon saw Dylan's approach as reckless, while Dylan saw Simon as overly analytical. The hidden animosity reflected Simon's greater battle for self-recognition as a poet and pop artist. Simon overexerted himself, frequently to the detriment of people around him, in an attempt to equal or surpass Dylan's cultural importance. The Graceland colleagues stood for Simon's more overt struggles with creative limitations, while Dylan represented his more subdued adversary. Graceland, which came out in 1986, was a game-changer. An energetic fusion of Simon's reflective poetry with South African beats. It revitalized his career, which resulted in Grammys and critical praise. Its genius, however, was met with controversy, as was typical of Simon's work. During that period, South Africa was still under the yoke of apartheid, and there was an international cultural boycott. Inspired by a vision, Simon disregarded the boycott and went to South Africa to collaborate with local artists. He saw the music as an audacious effort to unite people of different backgrounds. But activists and detractors saw it as a rebellion that ignored the South African people's political struggle. Even though South African performers like Ladysmith Black Mambazo were introduced to the world through Graceland, Simon's relationships with some of his partners were tense. Some musicians allegedly felt unappreciated or marginalized despite the album's success. Simon found these criticisms perplexing because he had provided these musicians with a worldwide platform. However, the dispute brought to light an ongoing issue in Simon's career: his tendency to have tunnel vision or an overly focused attention on his job to the detriment of people around him. One negative aspect of Simon was his obsession with perfection. He became the kind of musician who could create groundbreaking works that defied genre boundaries, like Graceland, or enduring anthems like The Sound of Silence. On the other hand, it rendered him an extremely difficult partner to win over. Unyielding in his pursuit, his expectations were lofty. Collaborating with Simon presented a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for some. They barely had time to express themselves because it was such a draining undertaking. The people closest to Simon were occasionally alienated by his need for control, even when he was triumphant. The triumph of Graceland ought to have been an occasion for boundless joy, but instead it became a flashpoint for debate. Although the cultural appropriation claims were fiercely contested, they highlighted how Simon's drive could eclipse the teamwork he aimed to foster. Much like his music, Paul Simon's personal struggles will live on in his legacy. He struggled under the pressure of comparison with Bob Dylan, trying to establish himself as more than just a contemporary. He wanted to prove he was on par with Dylan. He and his Graceland associates skillfully navigated the delicate balance between admiration and exploitation, frequently failing to see when he had over the line. The fact that these conflicts persisted beyond the individual level reflected Simon's relentless drive for excellence, a quest that frequently necessitated giving one's all and seldom allowed for any wiggle space. The choice of Art Garfunkel to speak out against Paul Simon goes beyond a simple venting of frustrations. It provides insight into the price that talent demands. There has never been any denying Simon's amazing talent. His music has become an integral part of popular culture due to its reflective lyrics, vivid storytelling, and timeless melodies. Generations have been moved by his lyrics, which are sometimes equated to poetry. However, as we are reminded by Garfunkel's admissions, this genius was not achieved without unintended consequences. Although his perfectionist nature was both his strength and his Achilles heel, the very traits that made Simon famous also made him a very difficult partner to work with. Envision Paul Simon bent over a notepad, meticulously composing lyrics until he had nailed his intended meaning precisely. Evidently, this is the level of commitment one would expect from a skilled craftsman. For his co-workers, it may seem like an unforgiving, exhausting, and relentless force. As a result of Simon's obsessions, Art Garfunkel frequently took the hit. Simon refused to settle for anything less than perfection. You may say it was worth doing if it was flawless. His unwavering determination was crucial to his achievements, but it frequently strained his relationships, making his colleagues feel like tools rather than partners. It is possible that Simon's music with Garfunkel best exemplifies the paradox of his brilliance. They had heavenly harmonies and a cohesiveness in their music that seemed almost divine. However, a tense dynamic lay beneath those melodic undertones. Despite the impression given by their music, their relationship was far from harmonious. As a lyricist, Garfunkel frequently felt that Simon was too dominant, especially when it came to his ethereal voice. Simon, on the other hand, battled an indomitable desire to prove himself, despite all the praise he had received. They danced together delicately, creating unmatched beauty but also leaving profound devastation in their wake. Consider the fact that they split up in 1970, right as Simon Garfunkel was enjoying his greatest period of fame. Bridge Over Troubled Water is a record-breaking album, so most duos would have enjoyed the spotlight. On the contrary, Simon and Garfunkel's collaboration was crumbling as a result of their artistic and personal disagreements. It was a chance for Simon to stop being a shadow of Simon and Garfunkel and be himself. The ease with which Simon could cut ties whenever he felt limited was a sobering reminder of this for Garfunkel. Not only did their creative collaboration come to an end, but so did a friendship that had started in childhood. Paul Simon left behind a legacy of contrasting extremes. One may argue that his music is lauded for transcending generations and continuing to have a profound impact. However, the road to his achievement was paved with broken relationships, lost chances, and the emotional toll of his insatiable drive. Although it drove him to produce works of extraordinary beauty, his perfectionist tendencies drove a wedge between him and those closest to him. Simon Garfunkel's music has been an inspiration to millions for decades. Bridge Over Troubled Water and Sound of Silence are more than simply songs. They are memorials to a collaboration that, warts and all, created something remarkable. However, the background of those songs is a powerful reminder that harmony can be born out of conflict. Simon and Garfunkel's common genius was an advantage and a disadvantage. It united them, but could never truly keep them together. Beyond his groundbreaking musical contributions, Simon Garfunkel's legacy stands as a monument to the precarious equilibrium between teamwork and autonomy, inspiration and friction. The story shows the cost of striving for greatness, which neither guy was able to escape. Although Paul Simon's brilliance was astounding, it frequently made him feel alone. Beautiful and cruel, harmonious and discordant, triumphant and regretful. That is the legacy it leaves behind. Even the most remarkable accomplishments are influenced by the intricacies of the individuals responsible for them. And maybe that is the reason why their narrative is so profoundly relatable.